This is Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Shortly after the shooting of 2 National Guard troops in Washington, D.C., the Trump administration said it was pausing asylum decisions and halting visas for Afghan immigrants. The alleged shooter is Rahmanullah Lakanwal, a Bellingham resident who came to the U.S. from Afghanistan in 2021. The motive for the attack is unknown. Victims include 20-year-old Sarah Beckstrom, who was killed in last week's shooting. The attack has supercharged restrictions on migrants from 19 countries, primarily in Africa and the Middle East. And it has left many others in this country fearful about their future as the federal government turns new scrutiny on green cards and asylee status already granted. There is a lot happening on the immigration front. And when things like this are going on, I often think to myself, we should call up Luis. I don't know how you feel about that, Luis, but I think I need help navigating all this. And so just to welcome you in here, Luis Cortes Romero is an immigration lawyer and managing partner at Novo Legal Group. Thank you very much for coming in again, Luis.
Thank you so much for having me.
So since the shooting of 2 National Guard troops in D.C., we've seen all of these federal policy changes. Can I get a read? I want to go through them one by one, some of the things we know so far. But for you, what has been the biggest policy with the most widespread impact that you are watching?
Well, I think the biggest impact we're going to see is that they put a moratorium on all kind of immigration of any kind from any Afghan national. And so as long as they are from Afghanistan and have an Afghan passport, then there's a complete moratorium. And so that means that there's families that are continuing to be separated. That means that those who have been waiting years to get their cases adjudicated now have to wait longer. And it also means that they're going to, those who have had benefits already granted to them are going to have those benefits re-examined and re-vetted and re-looked at.
So there is the specific Afghan part of this. Let's stay with that for now. There's also these wider questions about the 19 countries where the Trump administration has said that there's going to be a review of green cards, and Kristi Noem putting the word out about a new travel ban potentially. Let's put a pin in that. So for now, with the Afghan nationals specifically, nobody is going to be coming in, no new status granted. What about people here already? Could they be deported? And it's like hundreds of thousands of people at this point.
Right. So the short answer to that is yes, because, anybody who's going through an immigration process, especially if they're in the immigration courts, they are oftentimes waiting to see, the judges are waiting to see whether they're able to be granted some sort of status. And so if there's a complete moratorium about being able to grant them status and the immigration judges are under a lot of pressure to finish up these cases, then the next part of that equation is, well, we have to finish up this case. We can't grant you anything to stay. So to finish up this case, we're going to order you to leave. And that seems to be the next step in this process, which really is it's unsurprising as part of the Trump administration's broader immigration policy, which is to have a restrictive immigration policy. They're trying to not just restrict all immigration, but trying to reduce the amount of immigrants here. So this undoubtedly will have the mechanisms to do that, but also would force people to leave on their own if they can't get their cases adjudicated, if they're having loved ones who are separated, who are still in London or who are still in Egypt waiting to be reunified. Then now it's going to be years before they can get their status granted or be reunified. They may be thinking about other options.
And then let alone the fact that these are, many of them, people who fled as the Taliban took over after the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. The program where Mr. Lakanwal and his family came in was called Operation Allies Welcome, 70 to 80,000 people coming in. And these are considered people who worked with the U.S. Lakanwal was one who worked with the CIA and were fearful about staying under the Taliban, who would naturally view their cooperation with the U.S. negatively. The argument from the Trump administration about especially the Afghan pause is there was not enough vetting as people were coming in after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I know you're not like a national security expert, but on the immigration level, when somebody comes in on what is virtually refugee status, my understanding when they first came in from Afghanistan, and then eventually they were granted asylum, like in the Lakanwal case, What is the vetting process like? And do you find it credible that there could be some problem with vetting for Afghans specifically?
I don't find it credible that they would not have any kind of vetting mechanisms, because there's multiple layers of vetting that an individual has to go through to start to even get a travel document to leave the country to enter the U.S. There's a vetting process there that's done by the Department of State. Certainly individuals who were working with the government, reporting to the government, like in this case where he was working for the CIA, there was a vetting that happened there. Upon arrival to the United States, Customs and Border Protection does another layer of vetting in order to allow them to come into the country. Just because you have a document that allows you to get into a plane doesn't necessarily guarantee you the entry. So there's another layer of vetting there. Then after he was here, he applied for asylum, and there are multiple rounds of vetting that goes on at that point. They take your fingerprints time and time again. And then right before they grant asylum, one of the things that the immigration judges asks of the immigration prosecutors that are there is our background checks complete? That's standard. And so they vet them there again. So there's a multiple layers of vetting process. And this isn't a partisan issue where it was done because he entered in through the Biden administration program, but he was ultimately re-vetted again and granted asylum during the Trump administration program. So this tragedy wasn't necessarily a product of a lack of vetting of any kind.
We should say, too, that the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, has kind of given conflicting information when she talks about the vetting. That is one issue that she claims there's a problem with the vetting for Afghan nationals. The other thing is she said that the suspect, Rahmanullah Lakanwal, was, quote unquote, radicalized in the United States. We have heard from AP reporting that there were serious mental health issues involved here in this case, where he was going periods of time in a dark room where he wouldn't speak to his family. And then he would have these manic periods where he would go driving. Those mental health issues seem to be something that had developed since he arrived in the United States, and doesn't seem to be something that would come up on a background check, for example. And so the question is this an immigration issue at all? Or is this an issue of mental health, somebody who's a veteran of, a conflict, things like that? I don't know if you have any reflections on that and how this has reverberated in the immigration space despite that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because this seems to be less of an issue of an immigration consequence or of a broken immigration system. This really seems to be a conflict of the failure to recognize the impacts of war and the individuals who see war. In this case, we have somebody who worked directly for the CIA in military operations against the Afghanistan. But by the way, starting when he was 15 years old. And so
he was a child.
He was a child. And so when you have all of that and you come into the United States and you have those mental health issues, these are products for individuals who have seen combat. And we've seen that with our veterans too, whether they're citizens or not citizens. And there is a lack of resources for individuals who need mental health assistance, especially for those who have seen combat abroad. And so it really, really stems from there.
I want to ask about each of these other changes to the immigration system that go beyond the Afghan nationals specifically. One of the big changes has been the pausing of all asylum processing. So all asylum cases broadly, not just Afghan nationals. Does this put people who are in that process in a similar position, as you mentioned, of uncertainty and then potentially, if you can't be processed, that means you have to get out?
Yeah, there's a lot of things interplayed here. One of them is a bit of a moratorium for individuals from certain countries who are, as the government puts it, going to be ineligible to apply for asylum. One of the other things that is happening right now is that the Trump administration seems to say that there is an agreement between the U.S. and certain countries of Central America, where the Central American countries have agreed to take on a specific amount of nationals in order for them to seek asylum there. And so what they're telling people from Venezuela, what they're telling people from Cuba or they're telling even people, asylum seekers from Mexico is, you know what, you're not going to be able to seek asylum here, and instead you're going to have to go to Honduras and then seek asylum over there. So while they're blocking some of the available immigration relief here, the ability to get legal status and to actually do things, as some people say, the right way, they're blocking that and trying to redirect them another way. So all of these things are kind of interplaying kind of together. So when we see the government right now saying these countries are now going to be prohibited from getting certain immigration benefits, it's a way to redirect them then into some of the other countries that might take them, or in order to just push them out, either by through the immigration court systems in order to get an immigration a deportation order, or in order to make things so exceedingly difficult for them so that they would leave on their own.
Okay, so the asylum system specifically, and that's for people, to be clear, that present in the United States. That's the asylum system. So from somebody like Rahmanullah Lakanwal to a person who crossed into the United States and presented themselves to immigration authorities, those are asylee cases. Then we have the refugee system, which more widely has been virtually stopped except for very specific cases, and it seems to be white Afrikaners from South Africa who are being granted refugee status, and pretty much nobody else. Now, that is, something that has been halted for a long time, so there's no major changes there. What about the reassessment of asylum cases that had approvals issued during the Biden administration? This is something that was announced, again, in the wake of this attack. That is a lot of cases, people who were granted asylum under Biden. What could that mean? What is the practical implication of that? How could that review actually be undertaken?
Well, I think the way that it's going to play out is yet to be seen, but we have an idea of what it might look like because we've seen a version of this before. I think for individuals who already have some sort of status granted, whether it's their green card or otherwise, and they're trying to get to the next steps, for example, someone who's obtained a green card and trying to apply for U.S. citizenship, or they have their asylum or refugee status and are trying to apply for their green card, I think that they're going to go through an administrative system where their applications are effectively going to be stuck. We saw this a bit after 9/11 when individuals try to apply for citizenship, and they were going through this extreme vetting process. But what that really meant is that they were just kind of siloed and stuck in a box somewhere, and they weren't adjudicating them. And it was under the guise of national security, and so it was insulated from a lot of review until eventually it got to the point where it was just years and years of waiting. And so what happens is the domino effect of, well, if individuals can't stabilize their legal status for something more permanent, like stepping from refugee status to a green card holder, or from a green card holder to a U.S. citizen, then they aren't able to petition their family members to come in, so they remain separated. Or they are not becoming eligible voters if they are precluded from getting U.S. citizenship, and so they're just kind of stuck in this green card status. And so these are the kind of things that can happen. Now, one of the things that I think we might see from the Trump administration that we saw from the first Trump administration is that they may look at any kind of minor infraction as a pretext to try to revoke also their status. And this could be as simple as a typographical error or some sort of administrative error that occurred where ultimately it may be inconsequential, but they're using that as a basis to then revoke people's statuses. And so what that also would mean is that the government's limited resources are going to go to that instead of helping processing the backlog that has just occurred from the government's program, the immigration programs just being so understaffed and underfunded for decades.
So asylum cases under Biden being reviewed more broadly, there is a more specific focus on those 19 countries when it comes to green cards. The Trump administration says it is going to review the 19, people with green cards from these 19 countries, and it's a long list, but it includes Afghanistan, Chad, Republic of Congo, many African countries, Haiti, Iran, Libya. There is Myanmar in there, Venezuela, Cuba. This is, again, mostly from Africa and the Middle East, but also some Latin American countries. Have we ever seen green cards get reviewed at scale in this way? And what exactly happens when that many people who think their status is stable suddenly are under the microscope again?
This is certainly one of the largest scales that we've seen, I think, in recent history, where they're doing a backwards-looking review on the green cards that were, or statuses that were established by a prior administration. Now, to be clear, I'm not really sure what that review process would look like.
Nobody seems sure, yeah.
Right. And the processes that the federal government has had to vet and review folks has been established for decades and built upon year as technology moves forward. Both administrations or both sides of the political aisle have increased and reviewed those vetting processes. So there's not something that the Biden administration or really any other administration prior to President Trump stopped doing that now President Trump is doing. The processes are very similar and the same. I think what they're looking at is that they're going to just go ahead and review them just for the purposes of either, again, finding any minor infractions or for pretext to try to get individuals to worry about their status. But something of this scale has not been seen before.
I'm talking with Luis Cortes Romero, an immigration lawyer and managing partner at Novo Legal Group, because there's just been a flurry of immigration changes in the days following the tragic attack on National Guard members in Washington, D.C. Luis is helping me navigate all of the new information and the implications as we know them now, because, again, every day something new gets announced. So Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem posted on Monday night on X, "I just met with the president. I am recommending a full travel ban on every damn country that's been flooding our nation with killers, leeches, and entitlement junkies." Again, this is a quote from X from the Department of Homeland Security Secretary. Noem goes on to say a lot of derogatory stuff about people she calls foreign invaders. Reading this X post, I'm just going to editorialize here that I have a hard time believing that Kristi Noem has actually met somebody from one of these countries, because I don't think she would use this language if she had. She ends the post saying, "We don't want them, not one." So a new travel ban appears to be in the works. The president had said on Thanksgiving Day that he wants to suspend all migration from what he calls third world countries. It's confusing to me, Luis, because there was a travel ban that was announced in June. I don't understand what the difference would be here or what they're talking about. But how does it land with you in the immigration legal space?
I think that using the tragedy that occurred and applying it to a national security risk more broadly, and playing off not just the emotion, but the tragedy that occurred, and couching it in with being a vetting problem from a very specific type of country problem, gives the Trump administration further, or what is perceived further legal cover in order for them to justify it in the courts. Because one of the things that has been difficult for them was to try to justify some of their actions with the courts, or to try to explain or justify how it's not a race-driven policy. And so when they couch it in these more broader national security concerns, they can point to that and say, well, as part of the executive branch, we are able to make these tough decisions and we have to do it because look what happens. And I think judges are going to have a more difficult time trying to intervene and saying, well, as a co-equal branch of government, I think we have to let them do that if it's under the guise of national security. And so I think the more that they layer onto that, the more that they're really trying to set themselves up for a foundation to provide themselves legal cover when it inevitably gets tied up in the courtrooms, because this one-size-fits-all policy really doesn't fit most individuals who this policy is supposed to be applied for. And so really that seems what it looks like, because if we start from the position of the policy of the Trump administration is to prevent further immigration and to remove people who are here, then the decision starts to make sense. Because, for example, if we look like the travel ban from Venezuela, we have not had terrorist attacks from Venezuela. They don't provide a terror threat. However, the Trump administration is saying that they are channeling drugs into the country. And so that's why they're taking both military action in the Caribbean and why this travel ban is supposed to be applied to them.
They also revoked temporary protective status from thousands of Venezuelans. I don't understand how that, would somehow protect us from drugs being funneled into the country when these people have been here for years. But yeah, there's been a number of moves. Yeah, correct.
And then that we couple that with the recent announcement that the Trump administration is going to pardon the former president of Honduras, who was convicted. Him and his brother were convicted in the United States for drug trafficking. And so it's not a drug prevention issue. But again, you look at it within the eyes of, okay, how the Trump administration is trying to stop immigration and get people to leave. Then the decision to end temporary protected status makes sense, despite kind of whatever their the initial pretext decision or the reason that they're giving. And a lot of these decisions starts to make sense when it's against that backdrop.
Two things I'm wondering about. One is people appear to be foreign invaders, according to the DHS secretary and the president, if they come from these specific countries. But he doesn't think, immigrants from Europe, for example, are foreign invaders. I mean, how is this not very clearly a racially motivated immigration policy like what we saw with the Chinese Exclusion Act or any number of waves of things in the 19th century that and early 20th century that the U.S. government conducted? That's one. Two, do you think that any judge, and you've presented a case before the Supreme Court, do you think that any judge takes seriously that the Trump administration is within its rights to consider, a basic green card that was issued to, say, an engineer over at Microsoft to be somehow a national security threat because they're from a certain country? I mean, those are two big questions, but yeah.
Yeah, I think to start from the basis that the government or the court system do allow the government to make decisions based on race or nationality, so long as it has a compelling reason to do so, and that the policy is very narrowly tailored for that compelling reason. So it's not an outback prohibition. And one of the ways that historically the courts have given some leeway to the executive branch has been during times of war. And so during times of conflict and combat, because it becomes a broader, not just national security issue, but a diplomatic issue. And so that's how something like the Japanese internment camps were able to withstand judicial scrutiny or scrutiny by the courts, because it was done within the context of World War II. And I think that that's what we're seeing now a lot with the Trump administration is that there's a lot of talk about military action, war, invaders. And so they're trying to couch a lot of these policies in what seems to be a wartime effort.
Are we at war with Haiti?
Well,
Haiti is under, incredible pressure. People are, really suffering there, but we're not at war with Haiti.
I think that really begs the question as to what does it mean to be in war with a country? And I think in modern day times, what the Trump administration has tried to say is that there's been a de facto invasion by all the individuals coming in, and that this is an intentional act by foreign governments. Now, this is the way that they've been trying to justify, for example, sending Venezuelans over to the CICOT Center in El Salvador, saying this is an invasion, and they try to enact the Alien Enemies Act. But courts are able to see through that. But I think that that's the justification that they're trying to go through. So they're pinpointing these countries, saying there's an invasion coming in, and it's a national security risk, and so we're in, and they're using this rhetoric on purpose so that they can funnel it into legal papers. I mean, they changed the Department of Defense to the Department of War specifically so that they can continue to use this verbiage and try to get it to be normalized and try to have individuals associate decisions that the government is making with wartime efforts, because those are the time where the executive branch has really yielded its most power, and the country has given the executive branch the most power is during wartime. And so this is the Trump administration's effort to try to couch as much of power as he can exercise through kind of this wartime rhetoric.
The president was also mused about denaturalizing people. He said he'd love to do it. He doesn't know if he has the power. Does he have the power to denaturalize, Luis? It's
a process that has to go through the courts, and there has to be a reason.
There has to be an actual hearing case. People get to defend themselves.
Yes, and it has to be done through a federal court. So it doesn't go through the immigration court systems. It has to go through a federal court system, and those efforts are rare. Usually, it's where something wasn't caught in the beginning and it was consequential, and it was in a circumstance where somebody hid a material fact or something that occurred. And so they're rare that they occur. They have been attempted to in the past, and not only is it an extraordinary amount of resources that go into it, because you need to have a full-blown trial that costs thousands and thousands of dollars, but they're hard to win. And so especially if years and years and years and years have passed since the person has been naturalized, there's an interest that a person gains in their citizenship that the government or the courts recognize as a protected interest. And so he could try. And again, the efforts here aren't necessarily always to be successful in the efforts. It's to get people so worried or so scared in their mere presence that they consider leaving. And so one of the biggest tools in this mass deportation process is to try to get people to leave on their own through fear. And it's working.
Yeah, what have you seen when it comes to that in your practice and in talking with other immigration attorneys? People are choosing to leave.
They are choosing to leave, and they're also choosing to give up cases that are otherwise very meritorious. For example, we've seen a lot of clients from Venezuela who have come to the U.S. because they hold pro-democracy, pro-capitalism views, something that is not present in Venezuela, and they are very discouraged about not just applying and whether the prospects of prevailing in their case, but really feeling unwelcomed. And so they're thinking about other options. People are thinking about their kids and whether or not, they might be detained. And then that kind of sort of Damocles of sorts of just handing over them. People are really kind of making decisions based on that. And so we are seeing a lot of people give up on their case or otherwise just think of alternative options.
We've covered a lot of ground today. Is there something that we haven't talked about that you think people should have eyes on or be aware of when it comes to all of these changes in federal policy and how it's affecting their neighbors here in the Seattle area and the Puget Sound region?
I think one of the things that we're going to see often or a lot more of is an increased amount of detention. And Washington State has really been ground zero for the last year as to what legal policies can be implemented to try to hold people in detention for as long as possible. Because if you hold people in detention, that in itself is a coercive mechanism to get people to leave. People don't want to be detained. And if cases languish for months or years, they rather give up on their case than to try to fight it. The Northwest Detention Center, which is one of the largest detention centers in Tacoma, it's in the country, but it's located in Tacoma. There have been policies there to hold people there under what is called mandatory detention. It was the first one in the country to really hold a policy like that, and then it spread to the rest of the country. And so there are lawsuits that are now being filed.
And what does mandatory detention mean?
Mandatory detention means that an individual gets detained without even the possibility of getting any kind of bail or any sort of release, that they have to fight their case while they're detained. And so that they have to just sit there. And even if they win their case, if the government decides to continue fighting it through an appeal, they continue to be detained. They have to
stay in detention.
Yes,
wow.
And those can take months or sometimes years. And so when faced with that prospect, individuals are now making economic decisions. How long is it going to take for me to be here? It's going to take 6 months. That's a long time without, I'm going to lose my apartment. I'm going to lose everything I have, and I'm going to come back to nothing. I'd rather just leave. Mm-hmm. Or they have kids to feed. And so the Washington State has really been a place where the litmus test of how long they can keep people detained and what policies they can to force people to be detained has really been developing. And I think what we're going to see is a lot more of that, is a lot more policies to keep people detained. And now if we're seeing individuals being targeted just based on their nationality, we need to have a vigilant eye to make sure that the government doesn't just detain people just solely based on their nationality, because we've seen that happen before, and we've seen the community and the courts allow that to happen before through the Japanese internment camps, and we just cannot let that happen again. Luis
Cortes Romero, I know you're on the way. You've got court today. You're dressed up and looking much more like an adult than I am today. So I really appreciate your time. Any final thoughts here before we go?
I think that the greatest legal cases and the greatest legal victories are not won by the lawyers, but by the stories of the clients that we're so privileged to tell. And so for people who are listening, who are with loved ones or who are going through this, or they know someone to go through this, their stories are powerful and important. And that's what's ultimately going to change the trajectory of where we're going. So my last few words would be to kind of keep up hope.
Luis Cortes Romero is a partner at Novo Legal, and he was the first DACA recipient to argue a case before the Supreme Court. And I always, I'm grateful that story connected us, so that now ongoing we have this ability to tap your expertise here, Luis, and our listeners and myself are really grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.